Dr. Richard Veit is the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at Monmouth University. His research focuses on the historical archaeology of the Middle Atlantic region from the 17th through the 19th centuries. He's the author of many books, a couple of which are on the New Jersey State Library's 101 Great New Jersey Books lists. He's the president of the Society for Historical Archaeology. He's on the Council for the Northeast Historical Archaeology. He's also on the New Jersey Historical Commission, and he's appeared in television shows, written lots of articles. So he's quite the guy in terms of local archaeology. So we're happy to have him. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Richard Veit.
Thank you, Tom, for that very, very kind introduction. I should work on lowering expectations in the future. Do I just hit forward here? Is that all we need to? Okay, let's see. Point towards that. Oh, that might have been the wrong way. Okay, here we go. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. So we're going to be talking about the archaeology of the American Revolution. So it's a different way of looking at this very, very famous conflict. And this is largely based on a book that a colleague and I wrote last year. And he's Matt Kalos. He's a professor at Brookdale College, and he was a student at Temple University that I got to work with on his dissertation, which was about, surprise, surprise, the American Revolution. So revolutionary New Jersey unearthed. And we are in a great place to talk about the American Revolution because New Jersey is quite literally the crossroads of the American Revolution. We have a National Park Service designated heritage area at the crossroads. But when you look at our state's history, we really were sort of the epicenter of the revolution. So writing back in the 1970s, J.C. Harrington, who's a founder of historical archaeology, the field I work in, wrote, there's little chance that archaeologists will find anything that changes our understanding of the revolution. We all know that the Declaration of Independence was written on July 4th, 1776. So that was a sort of a negative approach, I have to say. So we haven't changed the date on the Declaration, but we have found a lot of interesting things. So just some snapshots of the Revolution. Washington's crossing of the Delaware on the upper left, the very famous Battle of Monmouth, fought not too far from here. The retreat would have gone right through this area. Upper right, bottom left, the Battle of Princeton, bottom right, the Battle of Springfield. So our state is at the center of the conflict, not just major battles, but also encampments, hundreds of skirmishes, and everyday life transformed by a revolution. So some of the first archaeology that went on in the state was done by this gentleman. This is Max Schrabish, and you see him in northwestern New Jersey in a Native American rock shelter. He's the state's first real archaeologist. He was hired by the American Museum of Natural History to go out and look for Native American sites in New Jersey. And he thought they were likely to be in caves because of very ancient sites are being found about the same time, this circa 1900 in France and Belgium. So think caveman, he's looking for the equivalent here. He became so well known that he was hired by a wealthy Somerset County landowner to look for the first American military academy. So when you think about military academies, you might think of West Point or Annapolis or Colorado Springs, but the first military academy was in northern New Jersey. It was in the area around Basking Ridge and Pluckaman. And it was a really unusual place. So let me step back just for a second. So imagine Henry Knox. If you don't know much about him, he's an American general during the Revolution. His previous career was as a bookseller in Boston, which you might think is strange training for a general, but apparently he read a lot of military manuals. And he petitions Washington about midway through the Revolution to build an academy for artillerists, for people who use cannons, because we really didn't have a lot of training in that. And Washington at first is not that interested, and then he goes along with it, and they build this Pluckerman Cantonment, the building in the middle. Let me see if the pointer works. Yep. So this is their academy. And then these are essentially barracks and workshops. And there are other folks with the army, including wives and folks selling them liquor, which they probably shouldn't have been doing, who have also set up shop. And they're there for essentially 2 years. And one of the things that comes out of this, besides a lot of well-trained artillerists who play a major role later in the war, is some interesting images and iconography. So this was found in an archaeological excavation at the Pluckerman Cantonment by one of Max's successors, a fellow named John Seidel. John was a Rutgers professor in the 1980s, and he carried out a massive excavation here because this area was going to be redeveloped into the Hills condominium development, where some of my cousins live today. So much of this area was lost. My favorite artifact that they found is this one. So this is a cartridge box insignia. So soldiers carried their cartridges in containers. They were wood and leather. And what I'd like you to take in is not just the cannon, but the flag, because scholars believe this may be the first depiction of a 13-star flag. And what's fun about it is it's not a circle of stars. It's 5 stars, 3 stars, 5 stars. So a little bit different than what we imagine Revolutionary War flags to look like. So Pluckerman survives now through the artifacts. Some pieces of the site were preserved. And now, thanks to computer imagery, we can reproduce what it once looked like. But this archaeology went on back in the 19 teens. So really our first project. There were other archaeological excavations in New Jersey during the Great Depression. So lots of folks were out of work. And how can you put lots of hands to work very, very quickly with minimal expenditure? Archaeology. So the CCC, the WPA, all had archaeological projects at Morristown and at Jockey Hollow, which is associated with Morristown. So these are winter camps from the Revolution. Over here, this guy looks like the Fonz or something. So all these young men are excavating a soldier's hut. That's the hearth where there would have been a fire. And these young men in their World War I surplus uniforms are counting artifacts and gluing them back together, just like archaeologists do today. We'll revisit Jockey Hollow a little bit later. During the bicentennial, there was a tremendous interest in archaeology, as you might imagine. And one of the more interesting sites that was discovered is in Bergen County, New Jersey, and it's the site of the Baylor Massacre. This is a very unfortunate incident involving George Baylor and the Light Dragoons. These are American troops who are encamped on a farmstead in Bergen County, and they are surprised by British troops under Major General Gray in a night attack. It's a bayonet attack. They are not expecting it. Many of them are killed, and the local folklore was always that the soldiers' bodies had been thrown into tan vats. The phrase may not be familiar. So a tan vat is essentially like an enormous barrel, like think 15 feet across, that leather would be produced in. So hides would be turned into leather. Tom Demarest, Wayne Daniels, and a group of high school students petitioned the local town leaders in Bergen County to carry out an excavation. I think everyone thought they won't find anything. It'll keep them busy and off the streets. Sure, let them do it. They went out, they excavated, they almost immediately started finding skeletons and the remains of these tan vats. And they even found items that allowed them to identify the individuals. I'm sort of grabbing my cuff here because they found cufflinks with people's initials on them. So they were able to identify the actual soldiers and then rebury them, and they created a very nice park commemorating them. The Battle of Monmouth is not only incredibly important in American history as a turning point in the Revolution, but it's also important for archaeologists because it's where archaeologists really first started using metal detectors to help explore archaeological sites. So in the 1970s and the 1980s, archaeologists saw metal detectors and ran in the other direction. They didn't like them at all. They thought they did a tremendous amount of damage to archaeological sites. But these three gentlemen from Monmouth County changed all that. So we're looking at Gary Stone in the center. He was with New Jersey State Parks and he was posted at Monmouth Battlefield. Looking at Dan Civilich over here from Freehold, who was an engineer slash metal detectorist who had a chance encounter with Gary. And you're looking at Ralph Phillips to the left. I think Ralph was living in Mattawan at the time. But the three of them got together, and I think, there may have been an issue that led to a good solution. I think there might have been some illicit metal detecting going on in the state park. And instead of reacting badly to that, Gary sort of brought everyone in and said, like, maybe we can work together on this. And you guys can find stuff. We can document it and we'll learn more about the battle. And this team, quite a trifecta, transformed our understanding of the Battle of Monmouth. And subsequently, their work provides the interpretation if you go to Monmouth Battlefield State Park. So what they did is wherever the metal detectorists found artifacts, they mapped them in to a very, very minute level. And using those maps, they were able to trace how the armies move across the battlefield. And the British troops are equipped with somewhat different weapons than the American troops, so you can tell who's where. And this really allows for a much richer understanding of the battle. I just have one image from them down here, and it shows cannons positioned up by the current visitor center, which is well worth a visit. And this is the spread of their shot on the battlefield. So you can tell where they were and where they were firing. And we can do the same thing with the British troops. So it's amazing. And this has been reproduced really across the United States now. Okay, so next let's visit, and this is a project I got to work on, a community that no longer exists. So I assume everyone is familiar with, and most of you have probably been to New Brunswick, New Jersey, right? So just across the river in the 18th century was a thriving little port town called Raritan Landing. It is not there anymore. It's sort of in Johnson Park under the Rutgers football stadium. There are only a couple buildings that survive from it. And this is about, God, this must be 15 years ago now. The NJDOT decided that they were going to reroute, whoops, let me go backwards for a second. They were going to reroute Route 18. So here's Route 18 as it's envisioned. And it was going to go through, and here's River Road, football stadium over here, Johnson Park over here. It was going to go through this entire colonial community that no longer existed above ground. The British had occupied Raritan Landing after the battles of Trenton and Princeton. So they fall back from Trenton and Princeton. They don't stay there. That didn't work out for them. They fall back to New Brunswick and they stay there the whole winter. When they leave New Brunswick and Raritan Landing, they largely burned this community down. So it was there underground, not above ground. I was asked to carry out part of this project looking for British Revolutionary War encampment. So I was given essentially this map, and this was the area I was to look at. This jug handle, emblematic of New Jersey, had not yet been constructed. So I drove out there with a van full of colleagues, and I parked. And I was trying to get oriented with my map. Always a little bit, of anxiety. People are watching you. You don't want to get lost in the woods when folks are following you. And a car pulls up, pretty big late model American car, and a gentleman gets out of it, gray-haired gentleman, big guy, and he comes up to me and he says, You looking for the Revolutionary War camp? And I said, yeah, but that's awkward. How do you know that? You should probably go buy a lottery ticket. You could kind of predict the future." And he said, I know because I found it. I could show you where it is. I said, okay. And he said, "Here, get in my car." Um, and the little crew of people that I was with, just as we tell kids, they were like, "Stranger danger, Dr. Veit. Like, maybe don't get in the car. Maybe we could follow him." And I'm like, "It's all good, guys." Obviously, this is not what you want young people doing, and I was younger and more foolish then, perhaps than now. So I drove off with this person. And we drove, it's not on the map, it would be like way over here. And then he parked me, so we have to walk into the woods now. Okay. Then we walked into the woods, the Rutgers Nature Preserve, and we got pretty far in. He pointed down on a path and he said, "This is where I found all this stuff." I said, "That's pretty fantastic. Um, but that's not where I'm being paid to look, so I can't actually do anything here." So we were both disappointed. He drove me back, thank goodness. Um, and we got to work excavating. So these are the two buildings. I'm a little bit out of order sequence wise that survived from Raritan Landing: the Cornelius Lau House on the upper left, and the Mettler Bodine House on the bottom right, both in Piscataway. The one on the left is a Middlesex County Museum. The one on the right is Piscataway Historical Society. This is what Bob had lured me into the woods with. Musket balls, lots of them, and I was very impressed when he pulled this out. So impressed that I lost like my good senses. This was quite a find. In fact, until recently, we thought this was the largest collection of musket balls found at any one spot in New Jersey. Bob unfortunately passed away last year. Before he did, he found another site where he found a couple hundred musket balls in one place. So, quite an active researcher. So when we walked into the woods at the site where I was supposed to be looking, this is what we saw. And this is a terrible scan of a slide that tells you how long ago I was taking these pictures. They don't scan so well. But I saw these mounds and I got very excited. I thought this might be like my National Geographic moment because I'm like, oh my goodness, I have a Revolutionary War fort here in the woods in Piscataway. What could be better? Um, so it turns out I was completely wrong. We metal detected this and we found lots of bullets. And in fact, one day, Bob, who attached himself to our project, he became a good friend. In fact, I learned later that he lived like 2 blocks away from me in South Plainfield. He was even more closely connected to me than I ever had imagined. Apparently, my mom, who was widowed, he'd asked her out on a date. She had said no, but he and I became fast friends, nevertheless. But he was metal detecting here one day, and he walked out of the woods because this was a little bit past our study area, and he looked ashen, and I said, like, you all right? What's going on? And he said, "I found something." And I said, "Well, you're always finding things. You're good at it." He said, "Yeah, well, it was rusty and round, and I was hitting it with my shovel. And as the rust came off, I realized it was a hand grenade." And I said, "Oh, so, well, what did you do with it?" He said, "Well, I threw it in the woods." And I said, but Bob, there are going to be bulldozers here like in a couple months. They're making a road. Like, what happens when the bulldozer hits the hand grenade? Like, how do we explain that?" And he said, "I don't know. You're going to have to explain that. I'm not looking for it." So it turned out we had found part of the training ground from Camp Kilmer, a World War II installation. And this was a backdrop for a shooting range. So it was lousy with ammunition, but very much from the wrong time period. But an exciting find. And happily, the road was built, and maybe the hand grenade was inert because it doesn't seem to have gone off yet. Here are the techniques we used. On the left, you have my friend and colleague Bob Winsack, metal detecting. This was very effective. On the upper right, we have Paul Young, who was my crew chief, the fellow who said, like, don't get in some stranger's car, digging shovel tests. These were not productive, but we dug hundreds of them. And on the bottom right, we have my friend Bob Winsek with a radar unit looking below ground. Because what we thought was British lose at Trenton and Princeton. They retreat to New Brunswick and Piscataway. They build huts. They're there for a winter. It turns out they were really in tents for a couple weeks, and then they moved into people's houses. They don't build huts there, but we didn't know that at the time. We did find artifacts, though, in the right place. So this was good. We found more musket balls in the upper right. We found gun parts. This is a ramrod thimble from a Brown Bess. This is part of a bayonet scabbard. Buttons, British buttons. Fouled anchor for the Royal Navy. This is in really rough shape, but you can sort of see the letter V or the Roman numeral 5 on it. That was really cool because we knew the 5th Regiment of Foot, a British regiment, had camped in this area. And this is a shoe buckle. And then the other thing we did is we put this all on a map. So all these little dots in different colors represent different types of artifacts, reflect where we're finding artifacts. And you can basically see we have like 2 big lines of them. And then we did more historical research. And what we think we're seeing is the lines of tents. So you've probably seen, I mean, we're in a library tonight. Those books like How To for Dummies, How to Program X for Dummies, How to Plant a Garden for Dummies. Well, there were similar books, they didn't call them for dummies, but for British officers during the Revolution that were essentially guides to military discipline. And they told you, here's how you set up a camp. You put your latrines over there, and you always do it this way. And here's how all the different things you would need to do. So we realized that we were looking at sort of the patterning of a British camp in the field. So that was a fun project. Going now to a different project. This is Middlebrook. Middlebrook is kind of a forgotten episode in the Revolution. But some of our students at Monmouth got to work on this. So Middlebrook doesn't exist as a town anymore. It's sort of Bridgewater and Bound Brook. And this is a winter encampment. There are 2 of them. There's a 1777 encampment, and there's one 2 years later. It may be the first place, again, where an American flag is flown. You don't hear a lot about Middlebrook because the soldiers were not starving. They were pretty well supplied. The snow was not that awful. It sort of worked out for them. And it's in the Watchungs. So again, following her Don Troiani paintings, Trenton and Princeton. The Americans moved north to Chatham and Morristown area. The British moved north to New Brunswick. This is in Chatham where the Americans probably initially camped. This is I was doing a similar talk to this one at the Chatham Historical Society. And I'd always heard they camped there. And they said, oh, we have a photo. And there's an X that marks the spot where the camp was from like 1870. So they broke this out. They said, that's the camp. I still haven't dug there, but I'm hoping to at some point in the future. So first they're in Chatham, but then as the spring wears on of 1777, the American troops moved down closer to the British into Bound Brook and Bridgewater. One of the cool things about doing research right now, and I know some of you are engaged in transcribing pension records from colonial soldiers, Revolutionary War soldiers, which is a super cool project, is there is more information available online than there ever has been. So George Washington's map collection is available online. Pretty awesome stuff. King George III's map collection is also available online. You can almost imagine them both looking at maps and trying to figure out the other one's move. And the University of Michigan has a remarkable collection of maps. I think this one is from Washington's collection, if I remember correctly. So this is central New Jersey, but it's pretty schematic. Here's Amboy, that's Perth Amboy. The sea is not really there, right? That's Raritan Bay. Woodbridge, Elizabeth, Quibbletown, great name. That's now part of Piscataway. And then the enemy camp. and that's New Brunswick. So it's on sort of both sides of the river. And if you go upriver, this is Middlebrook. So you have all the American camps in between the two ranges of the Watchungs. And the Watchungs are a natural fort. So it's perfect for Washington. There's still some great historic sites to visit in this area. Washington's Rock is one of them, a very tiny state park. And just a little bit more chronology, and then we'll look at the archaeology. Spring of 1777, the British will pull out from New Brunswick and they're going to head back to New York. There's fighting in what today would be Edison and Scotch Plains and Metuchen at a place called Short Hills. This is not the mall in North Jersey. It's a different Short Hills. It's a little further south. These are maps that show that fighting. There's been a little bit of archaeology there too. This is my favorite Revolutionary War image. So it shows George Washington, father of our country, up on Washington Rock, resting on his elbows, feet up, watching this battle. Lord Stirling fights the battle. He never goes down there, and he's with one of his assistants. And I just love this is the relaxed Washington taking in the scenery that we typically don't hear about. This is a marker at the site of the battle. Now a beautiful golf course in Union County. All right, so I was waxing poetic about this in one of my classes, and one of my students, Mike Brown, said, "I want to do my master's thesis on it. I want to find those camps." And I said, "Okay." So we looked at some maps. Here was another one. This is from like 20 years ago. And then we pulled out some historic maps and went, yeah, Washington's encampment is well marked. So we should be able to do this. There's Washington's fort up there. Washington's all over the place. And actually, here's Washington's, does that say headquarters, I believe. So we talked to folks who owned one of the properties, and this is called the Washington Campground. And they were very excited about us doing a little bit of archaeology. And then Mike did some amazing GIS work where he took modern maps and historic maps and overlaid them on each other. So this is the very congested modern highway network, Route 22, 287, Washington Valley Road. And then we went out and we tried to find these spots. He also said, like, these are 6 areas where I think we should be able to find remnants of the camp. And the beautiful thing about this is Mike Brown is a Long Islander. And I don't hold that against him. Long Island is perfectly fine, though I think New Jersey is the center of the universe. But he didn't really know this area. So this was like a double-blind taste test. He did all the mapping, but he'd never been in Bridgewater or Bound Brook. So he was doing this all from the maps. So then we go out, and the first place we stopped, I think, was number 1 on Washington Valley Road. And there was a historical marker there. So I'm feeling like my student has some good mapping skills. We got out of the car to look at the site. This is Alexis Alemi. Mike not only found a fort, he also found Alexis during this project. They went on to get married. That's what you always want to see happen with your students. Everyone ends in a better place than they started. This is, and Eddie Inman's over here as well, another one of our students. So you couldn't really see anything in the ground, but we put up a drone. Evan Midlowski did that for us. And suddenly we have this shape. And there's a little path cutting through it. These are our cars parked on the road. And this is one of those almost as dangerous as a fort, one of those like bouncy houses that kids have, like a backyard trampoline that showed up very well. So it turned out we were looking at a Revolutionary War fortification, or what was left of it, in Somerset County, literally in someone's backyard. So amazing work using modern technology. We also were able to pull some maps from New Jersey DOT that showed historic trenches right next to a road. So Good stuff. And then we tried to ground truth it. So we excavate. What can we find? Um, and that's Matt Kalos on the left. And I know this looks like a rabbit, but it's part of the mechanism, the firing mechanism, the cock, if you will, of Charleville, a French musket. So really exciting there. All right, changing gears entirely. Let's look at some underwater sites. So during the Revolutionary War, Great Britain has the finest navy essentially on the planet. The French Navy is quite good too. Spanish Navy is also good. The Dutch are pretty good. We don't really have a navy. We'll build a series of frigates during the course of a revolution, but states also build their own state navies, including Pennsylvania. And these are typically fairly small vessels. They call them galleys and gunboats. So this was a project that looked for the remnants of the Pennsylvania Navy. So here's a little missive memo, if you will, from George Washington, written at Valley Forge in 1778. So the British have captured Philadelphia. Washington and his troops are at Valley Forge, and the Pennsylvania Navy is stuck in the Delaware River. They have a problem. So here's what he says: Gentlemen, as the galleys can now be of no service in the river, and the enemy have it in their power to get them into their possession with all their cannon and stores, I beg leave strongly to recommend it to the board without delay to evacuate them of their cannon and stores, and removing these to a place of security in some interior part of the country, to maybe Kutztown, Pennsylvania, to carry the galleys up into some of the creeks and have them sunk. If there should be any other vessels belonging to the state in a river, I would mean to comprehend them. And if there should be any stores at Bordentown or other places on the river, these should also be removed to places of safety. All right. So they bring the vessels up the Delaware and then into Blacks Creek and Crosswicks Creek, and they sink them. A few decades back, during the bicentennial, archaeologists first looked for these sites, and they did find them. More recently, we went looking again. So you see two of my colleagues here. On the left is Steve Nagowitz from Stockton University, and on the right is Jackie Fisher from Monmouth University. Our goal is to see if any of these vessels still survive in the river. We timed this really poorly. We ended up on the river in February. It was warmer than this past winter. The river probably would have been frozen, but it was pretty cold. And we're using sonar to look below the waves. In this case, a fairly high-end hummingbird. If any of you have fish finders on boats, same technology. And we had images of what had been found previously. So I know this looks like, the skeleton of some dinosaur sticking out of them, but that is part of a Revolutionary War ship in the bank of the creek. Here is another image. Oh, I missed the most important part there. So we went back out with this new technology, and Jackie and Steve found two more vessels that hadn't been found in the initial survey, and she ended up getting a really nice article in USA Today about her discovery, which was super cool. And she works for the Navy at Joint Base McGuire, which was even cooler. So they're still there. Another underwater project had to do with privateers. So privateers are like legal pirates who have letters of marque that allow them to capture enemy ships. We had privateers, the British had privateers, and places like Tom's River, Tuckerton, and a place that no longer exists called Chestnut Neck were all real centers of privateering. So we would go out, we would capture British ships, we'd bring them back in, we would auction off their cargoes, and the British find this so annoying that they send an expedition to Chestnut Neck to essentially wipe out that nest of rebel pirates, their words. There's a nice historical marker where the community once was today. This is down by Smithville, sort of Atlantic County. And again, Steve Nagowitz, and this time working with Shannon Shearell, another Monmouth student, went out with the same technology and relocated several of the privateering ships or their prizes, the ships they brought back into port that were sunk during this British raid. One of them is quite famous. It's called the Bead Wreck. It's being undercut by currents now and probably won't survive that much longer. But next time you're driving down the parkway to maybe Atlantic City or Wildwood, and you go over the Mullica River and you're looking out, it's got a beautiful stretch of water and marsh. Underneath you, essentially, are these vessels from this battle during the Revolution. Some artifacts were brought up by Steve, and they're fragments of colonial wine bottles, so they're very much contemporary with this incident. All right, now this is a project that Adam Heinrich and I did here in Monmouth County. You can see Dr. Heinrich over here, and there may be some other participants in the audience from this. So one other story of the Revolution is a civil war with communities deeply, deeply divided. And God bless you. And for loyalists, it is very hard to stay at home in their houses during the war. And many of them leave their homes and move to Sandy Hook to a refugee community called the Refugee Town that was close to the famous Sandy Hook Lighthouse, the oldest operating lighthouse in the US. And this is probably a decade ago now. Monmouth University was asked to do an archaeological field project there. I was pretty excited about this. I mean, this is a cool spot to work for a summer. You'll notice if you look at the lighthouse that it has a ring around the collar. It acts like a wick, so it actually soaks up water, and that rises up the column of the lighthouse. So basically, the whole base of the lighthouse was going to be excavated, and just like you might seal a basement to stop water from coming into your basement, they're going to do the same thing here. So we got to do archaeology before that. This was not a hardship location to do archaeology. We always start out with historic maps, and here's Sandy Hook. Remember, of course, Sandy Hook has gotten a lot longer since the Revolution. It continues to grow northward, and the channel sort of sweeps in here right next to the hook and then up. So with a battery of cannons, you could easily control this area. The British hold Staten Island, Long Island, and Manhattan for the entire Revolution, essentially. So being able to get in and out of New York Harbor was very important. And even though the Americans, we repeatedly attacked the British forces here, were never successful. Many of those refugees, those loyalists, are folks of African American descent because the British have offered freedom to any enslaved people whose slave owners are patriots. So if your master is fighting with the Continental Army and you join us, you're free. That's the British deal. And this is an image of one of those African American soldiers, the most famous of whom is an individual named Colonel Ty, who was very active in this area during the Revolution. All right, so we went pretty high tech. We used a magnetometer to look below ground. We dug lots of shovel tests. We love to dig shovel tests. You can see the lighthouse right here. And here's Andy Martin excavating. We found the foundations of buildings. There have been several generations of lighthouse keepers' houses, so they were a lot of fun to excavate. But we did find artifacts from the Revolution. A knobbed whelk may or may not be from the Revolution, but it is New Jersey's state shell, so I figured I had to show it off. Part of a colonial bottle, creamware, pearlware, colonial ceramics, a porcelain teacup, and this is all found together in a little pit. And part of a brown bass musket, the side plate. In fact, here's a piece we found. That's what one looks like on a reproduction. Had a little mark on it to probably show you where you put it, almost like an IKEA kit. Great find from the Revolution. All right, going back to camp. Um, so Morristown has seen archaeology since the revolution, since this of the revolution, since the 1930s. This is the Ford Mansion, which was Washington's headquarters for 2 winters of the war. It looks a lot like Mount Vernon, doesn't it? Sort of the New Jersey version. So the National Park Service wanted to do a whole bunch of things at Morristown, and they asked Monmouth if we could look at some of the sites that might get disturbed. One is a place called Fort Hill, but we also looked at camps. So we used a bunch of different techniques. Metal detecting, again, all the little spots or artifacts we found. Radar, these are metal detector finds. This is a rich site. And we also did hand excavation. First site we were supposed to look at was a place called Fort Hill. And this is Fort Hill. And these little blocks are where troops were camped. There are thousands of guys camped there. It's a log hut city. And this is one of the worst winters of the war in terms of cold and problems with supplies. There's a lot of organization to a military camp. So if you're an everyday soldier, you and 8 to 12 of your best friends are in a 10 by 12 hut, getting to know each other really well and probably getting annoyed with each other. If you're an officer, you may have your own hut, perhaps with one for your servant to take care of you. So highly organized. Here's some reconstructed huts. Morristown is also seen of a mutiny in 1780 when unpaid Continental troops and poorly fed troops decide that they are going to march. They want to march to Princeton to meet with Congress to demand their back pay. They mutiny, they kill one of their officers, they wound another one. Anthony Wayne, their commanding general, tries to stop the mutiny. Then he thinks better of it. It looks like they're in a pretty bad mood. He says, I'll ride with you, boys. He doesn't make it all the way to Princeton. That might have been a career killing move for him, but he gets partway there. They do get, most of these troops actually re-enlist after they get payments. But this is part of the Morristown story, and we found some archaeology that relates to it. So as early as the 1850s, people are interested in Morristown. This is from Benson Lossing's History of the Revolution, and it shows a tourist at the Ford Mansion on horseback. Like, is this where Washington slept? And the gardener's like, well, actually, he was a little bit over that way. And then here's Harper's Magazine, same time period. These little piles of stones are all that's left from the huts. Later archaeologists did earlier archaeologists, I guess I'm the later archaeologist, Adam Heinrich and I are the later archaeologists, drew some nice maps for us of where they thought things would be. This is a great map. This gentleman, Duncan Campbell, would go on to found the Pennsylvania State Museum or William Penn Museum in Harrisburg. He's a colonel in the Army during World War II, and his maps are perfect. Like everything lines up. When we did archaeology, we found out that Mr. Campbell may have been improving on reality because things did not line up quite as well. And then here's my favorite archaeological predecessor at Morristown. This is the late great Ed Rutch. He was a big bear of a man, a former professional football player. He'd run the Museum of the American Indian, and he left us some really wonderful maps of the area where we would be looking. So our project begins, and we had a substantial grant from the National Park Service. We also had some colleagues from Rutgers, Newark. This is Pantelis Soupsis. He's from actually the Technical University of Crete. He was visiting New Jersey, and he is out there with us. I don't think they have like weed whackers like we do in Crete, because this man fell in love with American technology. He was very into cutting things down. So we're up on Fort Hill, and the first thing we were tasked with was seeing if anything was left this Revolutionary War fort. And as you can see, conditions are not good. And in fact, let me turn this into an advertisement for not buying potential invasive species. So most of what you're seeing here, this really green stuff, is also super thorny. That's Japanese barberry. Oh boy, does it spread. Underlying it was a luxuriant growth of poison ivy. And then we had lots of fallen trees. So this is like, I'm trying to get young people interested in archaeology. I take them out here and I have a mutiny on my own hands. It's terrible. Um, Ultimately, we spent a lot of time clearing and started excavating. This is very much a posed photograph. Archaeologists typically don't look that happy in the field all the time, especially when they're digging in rocks. But dig we must. And boy, did we ever find some things. Pretty exciting, huh? So these may be familiar. A quarter, a nickel, and 2 cents. All from the 60s or 70s, 1960s or 70s. So we think this is evidence for tourists hiking up to Fort Hill, losing some change among the barberry, getting the heck out of there as quickly as possible. We also found a link from a chain. This could be revolutionary. It could be 15 years ago. We don't know. Once we had everything cleared, though, there were big piles and clusters of rock. And here you see Safa Akhtar with a camera mounted on a pool cleaning pole here. We had to improvise a little bit. And we ended up taking literally thousands of photographs of the rock clusters. And then we stitched them back together using computer technology. So here's the hill. And we have a gun platform here. We have a gun platform there. We have 3 mounds of stone here. We think they didn't quite finish this gun platform, probably because they're busy mutinying. But we could see what they had constructed. We didn't have a lot of artifacts, but we had these features. The students were very unhappy, I would say, with the field school. So we retreated down the hill to look for huts and, and easier to work in locations. And the magnetometer showed us where huts should be. And we started excavating. And not a lot of soil in this part of Morris County. So it's pretty easy to trace out the huts. And the artifacts were great. We had part of a bayonet, side plate from a Charleville musket. They're almost all French, right? So the French are supplying the U.S. Army by this point in the war, 1779, 1780. We had homemade things like this cool fork, fancy shoe buckles, lots of USA buttons at this point because it's an American army. It's no longer all these different state units. And then we had some grape shot. This is an anti-personnel weapon that would be fired out of a cannon and do a lot of damage. Here, more pieces of grape shot. This is what it looked like when it went into a cannon. So part of the story of this mutiny is that soldiers are brought out to try and quell the mutiny. They have cannons, they have grape shot. They may indeed fire the grape shot at the mutineers. They apparently don't hit anyone. So they may have been in cahoots. But the fact that we were finding it was very interesting. It's not the sort of thing you just be like carrying around in your backpack. We were also asked to use these very modern technologies to look at an area that had been repeatedly plowed. They were like, there shouldn't be anything here. We want to put a rest station here. So we used radar, magnetometry, and metal detecting. And actually you could see, got the outline of a hut right there. So despite plowing, many of the artifacts were still in place. And then one of the most interesting bits of the story, these are animal bones, mostly from cows, is that the soldiers were supposed to be starving, but we found lots of fairly good cuts of beef bones that my colleague Adam Heinrich is continuing to work on analyzing. So they probably were starving at some times, but perhaps not the whole time they were there. Oh, and then this is so much fun. You probably all know the term unscrupulous. We've met unscrupulous people. We found a scruple. So we are not unscrupulous. That's a scruple. It's apparently a measure of weight that you use to weigh out very small quantities of things like medications. So we didn't know what it was when we found it. We took a little mold of it and sent it to some colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg who said, it's a scruple. So, and it turned out one had been found in the 1930s at Morristown. All right, my last story for you this evening. Bucklew Mansion in New Brunswick, New Brunswick's local history museum. So a couple years back, we hired a forensic anthropologist at Monmouth University, Amy Reyes, and she came to me and she said, do you have any skeletons I could work with? Awkward question. And I was like, no, I don't actually think I do. And she's like, that's too bad because I'm really looking for a project. And then I thought I had visited Bucklew Mansion, and when I was walking through the mansion, they had a skull in a case on display, and it said Count von Donop, killed Battle of Red Bank, American Revolution. So I said, I think Bucklew Mansion has one. You may want to call them. And she said, well, why don't you call them? I should have pushed her to call them. So I called and I said, do you guys have a skull on the second floor in a glass case? Count von Donop died in the American Revolution. And it was like a cold call. This had been maybe a couple of years. And they were like, what? They're like, like a human skull. You have one of those? And they said, no, we do not. But they took my number and they called me back a couple of weeks later. And they said, it turns out we did have a skull, but we gave it to Rutgers. We don't have it anymore. So, oh, okay. I said, well, so I reached out to the folks at Alexandra Library at Rutgers, and lo and behold, they did have the skull. So let me give you a little bit on Count von Donop. During the British siege, the British, let me do it a different way. The British capture Philadelphia in 1777, but they do it by going overland. So they fight battles like Brandywine, one of the biggest battles of the Revolution. They come up from the Chesapeake Bay. This means that the Delaware, the prime means of supplying Philadelphia, is still closed. They need to open it up. And the Americans have built forts at Red Bank and Mud Island. This is Fort Mifflin today. It's essentially Philadelphia International Airport's right here. So in 1777, the British decide to subdue these two forts. They send a fleet up the Delaware. You see it here. Those boats from the Pennsylvania Navy are here. And a group of Hessian soldiers are charged with investing or capturing this fort. They're led by Colonel or Count von Donop, a Hessian officer. The other thing that had been used by the Americans to close the Delaware, something called a chevaux de frise. So think of a telephone pole sunk in the river with an iron spike on the end that is to impale any ships coming upriver. They'll get stuck on these. This one was found during Hurricane Sandy in Pennsylvania, and it's now on display at Brandywine Battlefield. So this is Count von Donop before the Revolution, back in Germany, with his adoring dog, a rabbit that's not having a good day, a manservant back here, and here he is in the attack at Fort Mercer in a modern artist depiction. The Hessian attack on Fort Mercer is disastrous. It's an awful failure for the Hessians. It's a great success for the Americans. Von Donop and many of his men lose their lives. He actually lingers on the battlefield overnight. His leg is shattered. His men retreat. They send a guy out to get him. He says, I'm really too far gone. Don't worry about me. The Americans find him the next day. He survives long enough to have some sort of noble last words, passes away, is buried on the battlefield. This was apparently his grave marker in the 19th century. So this may be his skull that was sitting in a museum. Here it is again. So Amy looked at it. I looked at it too. I'm nowhere near as knowledgeable as her, but I thought it looked gracile. I thought it looked a little bit thin and light. But it's not that different from, let me go back just for a second, from the image, right? Kind of high forehead, like cheekbones. He doesn't have we're missing we're missing the teeth. And I mean, so I asked Amy, I said, like, what about the teeth? Like, did he have real dental issues? And she said, no, they're all pulled after this individual's dead. They're like broken out. That's not from before he died. He's got a broken nose. Um, so we actually did a resin cast of this, like a 3D model. We put a face on it, and it looked kind of generic. It looked a little bit like Von Donna, but it also didn't. Um, so the project sort of stopped there, and then I think this is 4 years ago now. Tom Christ, a colleague of mine, and Hilary Del Prete, a new biological anthropologist at Monmouth, said, can we look at that again? And they took dozens of measurements, the same measurements that forensic scientists use today when they're trying to identify unidentified remains. And they put them into a computer program called 4DISC. And that basically says, like, with a 90% chance of certainty, this is a Euro-American white male with ancestry from, let's say, Great Britain. So when they did that, they got a very, very different answer. Came back that Count von Donop, or at least the skull that has been apparently circulating for 150 years as Count von Donop, not Count von Donop, instead, a woman of white ancestry in her late 20s or early 30s. But the sad thing is, it appears she was dug up middle of the 1800s. People thought it was Count von Donop. I don't know if they were in the same grave or they're a couple feet off or what she was really doing there. The story goes that when Count von Donop's skull was dug up, the teeth were pulled out as souvenirs. That seems to match with this skull. Why teeth would make good souvenirs, I do not know. I don't have any teeth myself as souvenirs. And this skull has been misidentified for a century and a half. For most of that time, it was in a collection of a family of physicians in Gloucester County. And then the late Richard McCormick, president, the historian at Monmouth, the father of the past president of Monmouth, was apparently giving a Revolutionary War talk like this one in Gloucester County. And somebody said, hey, we've got some Revolutionary War documents and the skull of Von Donop. Would you like it? And I guess he didn't know how to say no either because he ended up with it and then it ended up in the Rutgers Library. If anyone has any skulls, I'm not actually interested. They're all yours. So just to wrap up, here are two people whose stories we do know from the Revolution, two grave markers. So after the Revolution, there's sort of the after effects, and grave markers are great reminders. So one for an American officer, one for a British officer, two of my favorites. On the left, you have Captain Nathaniel Fitzrandolph, who is buried in Woodbridge. He died in 1780 after the Battle of Springfield. He was 33. And the thing I would have you take in, pockmark. So the local folklore is that his stone was used for target practice by British troops. Maybe the story is too good to be true. The one on the right, marble affected by acid rain, in memory of the Honorable Captain William Leslie from the 17th British Regiment, son of the Earl of Leven in Scotland. Let me stop reading it there. So young Captain Leslie is grievously wounded at the Battle of Princeton. And arguably America's most famous colonial physician, the equivalent of Dr. Oz, is walking across the battlefield. Benjamin Rush, MD, his friend. And Rush sees Leslie. This is the Cliff Notes version, and basically says, like, you're remarkably familiar. And Leslie, who's probably in great pain and agony, says, yes, you stayed with my parents when going to medical school in Scotland and dated my sister. Rush packs up young Leslie with the American wounded and attempts to send him to the hospitals which are going to be created in Morristown. Leslie doesn't make it all the way there. He makes it to Pluckerman, where he's buried today. But I love this marker because it basically tells us, it gives us a glimpse of that story. So he fell January 3rd, 1777, aged 26 years in the Battle of Princeton. His friend Benjamin Rush, MD, and I think that's so important, right? They are on very much opposite sides of this war. His friend Benjamin Rush, MD, and he can't quite read it, but she says, commissioned this stone as a mark of his esteem. So this Revolutionary War, and the principles of which we're still debating today, was very much a civil war, and I think these markers really reflect that. So thank you so much for. I feel like I was very long-winded tonight, but thank you so much for your patience, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Some of the many people who helped. Yeah, go ahead, see if there's anything there. Yeah, go ahead while we're checking.
They must have had had all different supplies for these people. How did they get them from England? And how did the Americans make their own cannons? Did they actually make their own cannons at the time? Or were they all imported from France or anything?
Well, they would have, yeah, they're both great questions. So one of the great challenges for Great Britain is how do you keep these troops supplied in America? I think the initial assumption is when they get there, most folks will see the error of their ways and they'll soon become loyal subjects of the crown and they'll help supply us. That doesn't really happen. So keeping the troops supplied is an endless project for the British. It's remarkably expensive and hard to do. Yeah, it's quartermaster corps. So they are attempting to do that. It also means that early on, the British troops are living off these imported supplies, but increasingly they are seizing supplies from local residents, and that turns people quickly against the British. Um, your artillery, your cannons question is a good one. So I think the answer would have been at the time, if you could get a Dutch, a Spanish, a French, and English cannon, you would prefer that. But we do cast cannon, primarily iron cannon, at places like some of the ironworks in the Pine Barrens and some of the ones in northern New Jersey, like Ringwood and at Zion. It's a very specialized skill, and there are problems even with the cannons that are imported, the bronze ones and the iron ones from Europe, where if you don't charge it right, they'll explode. So it's something that we really lack early in the war. Yeah. Great question. So sure, yeah. Facial reconstruction work is being done. I have not, and I should have. That's a good point. There's ongoing work at two sites right now that I think is particularly interesting. So for the last several years, Jen Janowski from Rowan University and Wade Katz have been carrying out excavations at Red Bank that really complement the story I told about Von Donop. I got to assist 1 year with that, but Monmouth's field school typically falls at the same time. So they were looking at a little area outside Red Bank Battlefield Park, which is a Gloucester County park. And it's a pretty cool park for a county park. It has a very large Revolutionary War fort in it. And we don't have very many large Revolutionary War forts in New Jersey. The area they were looking at that the county was considering acquiring looked like it might have been part of the fort. And when Jen and Wade carried out excavations with a volunteer crew, they not only found a trench, but at the bottom of that trench, they found a mass grave with remains of Hessian soldiers, with military accoutrements, with a gold coin, really a lot of interesting artifacts. And working with the state police, they've created a face for one of these individuals. I don't know if they're going back this year. They may be, but that's open to the public. Across the river in Pennsylvania at Fort Mifflin in Philadelphia, Max Brown from University of Pennsylvania has been carrying out an excavation. And that's in part to learn more about the fort, but also it's a veterans focused project. So she's an archaeologist who works for the VA healthcare system. So soldiers essentially studying military conflicts in the past. I got to work on that a little bit too. And it's a fun project. So yeah, that was a great question. So we did. It's in Jockey Hollow. Yep. And there's now an interpretive sign. So you can hike up to it. It's been partially cleared. Now would be the time to go, to be honest. You don't want to go midsummer because everything grows up. But this time of year is still pretty good view from up there. And the gun platforms are pretty, they're impressive. They're massive. I mean, they were meant to hold artillery pieces that were firing and moving. Does he have any more? Does anybody, should we keep going with that? What's your preference? I could go. Yeah, let's knock him out. Archaeological, holy. He does. Wow. Okay, so current project that Monmouth University is engaged in is sort of Revolutionary War adjacent. We're looking at the palatial home of William Alexander Lord Sterling. Quite a name. He's an American major general during the Revolution, and he builds a house that he calls the Buildings up in Basking Ridge. And it was like he'd built a Frank Lloyd Wright house, and everybody else is living in a Cape Cod. Like nobody knew what to make of this place. It was completely over the top. So a strange holy grail for me would be I'd love to find an artifact that I could link like with his initials on it at that site. I don't think that's going to happen, but that would that would make my day. We've got one here. Yes, go ahead, sir. Yeah, so there's a Lord Sterling stables, like a riding stables. It is adjacent to that. We'll be there every Friday and Saturday in June, so come visit it. It's Basking Ridge. Basking Ridge, yeah. He's Basking Ridge, Bernardsville, that area. Yeah. Right by the Great Swamp. Oh, so he's a ringer. He knows. Uh-huh.
Constructed in Plainfield, New Jersey, but this was post-Revolutionary War, about 15 years after that. Have you heard of the project? I don't think there's digging or anything, but it was a great talk. And there was an actual American military fort in the town of Plainfield. Have you worked or heard of this project?
Yeah, I have heard. This is a really cool project. That should have been my holy grail. All right. So it might have been, was it Nancy Piwar who spoke? Nancy's wonderful. Yeah, she's great. So she and I've spent a lot of time kibitzing about this. I live in South Plainfield. She's in Plainfield. So this is a wild story. During the Revolution, the Vermeulen family, a Dutch family, owns a ton of land, and they lease land to the federal government to build a militia post. And it's a big deal. It exists for much of the war. And there are all these soldiers' diaries and pension records that talk about it, though nobody can spell Vermeulen, so it's really hard to look up. But super important. And then in the 1790s, we often forget this, we're in what was called the quasi-war with France. So it's sort of a war, but not fully. But we mobilize the army, and Alexander Hamilton is going to be the general in charge. And the Vermeulen family, I think, and I'm being a little, I think they sort of said like, would you like the fort back? Like, you could use it. Federal government comes in, they reopen it, like a closed military, and they have huts, they have the whole thing. They put up a monument to Washington. It was quite a place. Only exists for a year or two. Ryan Radice, who was a student at Monmouth, did some good work on it. And I think a professor from, it was an NJIT or Stevens, has been doing a ton of mapping to try and find it. I don't think, nobody's found an artifact from it yet. And that should have been the Holy Grail. I think that'd be so cool because we've got Middlebrook, we've got Morristown, you got Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. They're all fantastic. But a militia camp would be very different from a Continental Army camp. And I'd love to see, I hope somebody finds it. Maybe it'd be nice for me, but if somebody finds it, that'd be fascinating. I'm happy to live vicariously. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Okay. From the image I have, I cannot tell. We could try and get the original. And there are great, and I think it's wonderful. There are really good debates about sort of the first American flag. He probably knows this, but the folks at the Washington campground believe that their site, rather than Pluckerman, is really the site that the American flag was first flown. And I think they are believers in a 6-point star. And they have repro flags that they sell. I fly one 4th of July at my house. So, okay.
Here. Okay. Wondering if there are any projects going on in these places and any comments on the antagonism between Loyalists and Americans along the King's Highway.
Right. So there have been, I'm going to give an answer that's all over the place. So there have been some pretty wonderful archaeological projects in Middletown. Some of you may know the Johannes Leister House. Jerry Scharfenberger did major excavations there. Marlpit Hall, I've done some excavations. Rebecca Yeaman did excavations. Very interesting stuff that relates to enslaved people there. And obviously Marlpit Hall is an important site associated with loyalists. Dan Civilich, whom I mentioned before, metal detected some of the British retreat sites in Middletown and identified some of them. So artifacts have been found that relate to the revolution. And there's certainly other sites that could be studied, but haven't yet. And I guess Sandy Hook historically was part of Middletown. So, all right. Any from our live audience? Yes, sir.
You're in the colonial army.
Uh-huh.
If you wanted to be an officer, did you have to belong once to the British or to the French and English wars? How did you become an officer in a colonial army?
So militiamen often elect their officers, which is a little bit problematic because I might elect my brother-in-law because I like him and he might not have any military experience. Many of the ranking officers did have previous military experience with the British. So Charles Lee, who's kind of a problematic American general, he had served not only with the British, but as a mercenary in many different places. Washington had been with the Virginia militia. He really wanted to be a British officer. He'd never gotten an official British rank, but he'd been a militia officer. Other, like Gates, had also been a British officer. So we essentially create an army from scratch, and it works out, but it takes us a while to figure that out. British officers they're like career officers for the most part, but they can also buy commission. So if you have a really wealthy relative, they can buy you a lieutenancy or colonelcy, but they have a very professional officer corps, so you better learn how to perform quickly. Otherwise, even though dad bought that for you, it's not going to end well. So, well, yes, sir.
Did I hear you say earlier that you were not particularly interested in getting more stone.
That's true, yes. Oh, because it becomes so very complicated. Because I think, with the Von Donop skull, it hit Rutgers, probably, it got to Rutgers, I think, in the mid 20th century, like 1950s or 60s. So today, we have good legal protections for Native American burials. And so if you find a skull and you don't know who it is, often you're thinking in two directions, either something at modern crime scene, or this could be a Native American skull, and if so, you would want to repatriate that and work with descendant populations. So it becomes very complicated. Yeah. Though undoubtedly, the mass graves from the Battle of Monmouth have not been found. Battle of Springfield had mass graves. In fact, there are markers in the Springfield Cemetery that basically says there is a mass grave here. So there is the chance always of finding something. And Jen Janowski has found graves at Red Bank. And it's interesting. So the German government was interested in those Hessian soldiers. And if you were to find American soldiers, US government would have an interest. Uh-huh.
For a time where you had the seat of Hessians living there, a lot of Hessians, not Hessians, Tories.
Perth Amboy, yeah.
Perth Amboy.
Yes.
Once the war was over, did they go back to England, most of them, or did they sign some kind of a document that they?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so if you're in New Jersey and a revolution breaks out, the commonly accepted wisdom is, and I saw you have Maxine Lurie coming up as a speaker. She can do this in much greater detail than I can. But the commonly accepted wisdom is about a third of people are revolutionaries, Whigs, about a third of people are Tories, and about a third of people are like, just stay the heck away from me. I don't want any more in my backyard. When the war ends, we've had thousands of New Jersey men serve with the British forces in loyalist regiments. They really can't return home. So the British initially offer any of their troops the opportunity to go to a couple places. They can go to Canada and be resettled there. They get farms. It's not as easy farming there as it is here, right? So, but that is a possibility. They can go to the Bahamas, to Jamaica. If you're very wealthy, you might go back, you might go to England. But that would be like, it's like moving to Manhattan. It's like you have to have some financial resources to do that. And some folks, within just a few years, will attempt to come back home. And some are successful. Alexander Hamilton acts as a lawyer for loyalists who want to return home. He's a pretty effective lawyer. But for many, it changes the whole trajectory of their families. So that's a good question. Yes, in the back.
One more question. In regards to the Battle of Short Hills, I actually grew up in Madison, so I'm familiar with it.
Yeah.
My father-in-law used to golf there all the time. They actually did close that golf course. It's a beautiful just park now. From what I think is true, because they had a reenactment in 2017.
They did.
For the 240th. So my question is, has there ever been, forgive me, I was a little late, my coverage, has there been any archaeological activity in that park? It's a Union County park now, for the battle. I mean, there were a couple thousand combatants, I think, at that.
Yeah, the Battle of Short Hills is really interesting. So the British are leaving New Brunswick and heading towards Perth Amboy and Staten Island. Ultimately, they're going to go to Philadelphia. And I think they're also hoping to pull Washington into a battle. And instead of Washington and the main army engaging, William Alexander, Lord Stirling engages with the British. And it's sort of right next to the Plainfield Country Club. And the other golf course was Oak Ridge Golf Course, which is now a nice Union County park. So there's a whole area, piece of undeveloped land off Woodland Avenue in Edison has been preserved because it's part of the battlefield. So an initial survey, a little bit of metal detecting of a part of the battlefield, found gun parts and musket balls, which is typically your telltale thing. And then Middlesex County sort of working on a plan with Wade Katz, and I expect I'll be part of this as well to figure out how do we survey the rest of the battlefield, and can we do sort of a Monmouth battlefield thing and see how the troops move across. So just the way the battle happens is Sterling hits the British, and the British turn around on him, and it gets really messy very, very quickly. And there's fighting back and forth, especially over, and this goes back to your several cannon that are captured and recaptured. There's also a funny scene where one of the British officers like yells at Sterling, like, I'm coming for you or something. And Sterling has an American soldier just shoot him. And the British write about like, oh, young ensign, I forget his name. He was the bravest young man, but foolishly, and so he dies there. It's sort of an, I don't know, it's a strange phrase. I was going to say an underappreciated battle, but it's pretty significant. Um, and then the Americans disengage, they go back up into the Watchungs, and the British troops head to Staten Island. Sir. My favorite one was actually found by the fellow I talked about before, Bob Hall. So we were at Raritan Landing. Not only did he find, what may have been a hand grenade, but he brought a British cartridge box insignia that he found. And it said on it, Quo fata vocant. I do not know Latin, but I went to people who did. And they were like, that means wherever the fates take me. And that's the motto of the British 17th Regiment. And I was like, oh my God. And I could just sort of, imagine this young man in the British Army, in the Crown Forces, and he's quite literally, he's in Piscataway, New Jersey. Like, wherever the fates take me, I will do my duty. And here I am in New Jersey. Who would have thought? So, no, it unfortunately is not. It was acquired by a Revolutionary War artist, a guy Don Troiani, whose paintings are quite famous. Yeah.
Were the British soldiers paid better than the Americans?
Yes, and I would say they were paid more regularly, generally. Yeah, so there was a financial incentive to remain loyal. I think we made the right decision in revolting, but so well, you guys have been, thank you for being a fantastic audience and for all the great questions.